The virtual CISO moment is brought to you by vCISO Services, a leading provider of quality and experienced virtual chief information security officers for small and mid-sized businesses. Check them out at vcisoservices.com. Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer, and welcome to the virtual CISO moment and to the first episode of 2023. And this is also the first episode of season 5. We've got Dave Evangelista here with us. He is a vice president of information technology for a Midwest credit union. He has 20 years in banking and 24 years in law enforcement. Dave, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg. It's a pleasure to be on your show today. I appreciate it.
So, as we always start off, we're going to do the same format this year. If you could walk through your career, you've got a varied career, and that's part of the reasons why we wanted to talk today, both not only the IT side, but the law enforcement side.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to just kind of run that down because it could be a little confusing. I started out in banking. Then I decided I had that itch that I wanted to get into law enforcement. So I quit a rather good paying job in IT and decided to go be a cop. Against better judgment of some of my peers, I did the work for about 6 years, and then I went to a part-time status. But in that time, I maintained probably about an 80 to 90 hour work week. I was working full time back in IT again, and then in law enforcement, but in the cyber area. In 1998, I founded the United States Internet Crime Task Force, which was a 501c3 made up of police officers all over the world. I had about 50,000 officers in that organization at one time. And we focused mostly back then on crimes against children, internet predators, and so on. And then from there, as the FBI's teams, they got better at what they were doing. They were more connected. We kind of stepped back and let them drive that train, and then we went into more of an education and awareness around information security, and trying to help individuals pretty much secure their home wireless. We wrote some 101 level guides on how to do that. And then we were doing a little bit of advocacy work in grant writing and that kind of thing. The organization still exists today, though it's pretty silent at this point. And I do get some requests from time to time to help law enforcement with forensics. We're still a law enforcement assist agency in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where it got me. I retired 24 years as a patrol officer. And can't say it was a bad choice. It's really served me and the community well.
I would imagine that probably having the law enforcement, I don't know if I want to use the word mentality, but just that experience and all that. How has that influenced your IT career?
Yeah, I think, well, you know, the old saying is if you want to catch a crook, you got to think like a
Mm-hmm.
crook. But I think for me, it's given me a different perspective. The blinders come off a little bit when you're looking at situations a little more objectively. You're kind of thinking what the angle may be and then applying your skills and training to that. Of course, you always follow the money. That's really the big deal. That's the whole end game. If they're selling information, then that's what you want to do is follow that bread line. But for me, I think just having that law enforcement experience gives me the ability to approach situations in a calm, very calculating manner, making sure that we try not to overlook some of the small details. So, having that experience generally helps out when you're dealing with incident response. You have a little more structured because most of the time, let's face it, organizations they lack some of those skill sets in forensic gathering. They may not realize what might be necessary to collect or preserve. And so it's good to have that fresh perspective when you're coming into a business situation. You can kind of guide and advise.
Oh, absolutely. Like you mentioned incident response, I know that there can be opportunities, if you will, to do more damage than good if you've got good intentions and you're starting to investigate a security incident, an IT security incident, but you actually end up either destroying or compromising evidence for breaking chain of custody, for example. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Fruit of the poisonous tree. If you're if you're law enforcement coming in, there's certain guidelines they have to follow. You need to make sure that even though you give them consent, my advice has always been, when in doubt, get a search warrant, and this way you're covered. It's not so much a search warrant because the organization you're working with requires it, but it's more or less to help aid in the prosecution. Like, did you obtain that information lawfully? We did. We got a search warrant. We obtained the information. Now there's no question that the information was obtained in a proper manner. So those kinds of things to be mindful of: preservation of evidence. Not making sure that evidence on the PC is preserved for products like Encase and other types of forensic tools. You want to make sure that you're not doing a lot of your own diagnostics. If you feel like that particular piece of evidence needs to be examined further, it's best probably just to leave it alone, let somebody get into it forensically, and then after they're done and they've cloned it, you can come back through and do your secondary civil inspection of that data.
What if I'm just sort of following that path for a little bit because
Mhm.
this can be a threat sometimes, but what would be the best thing for an organization to do if say I know that sometimes law enforcement would say leave the machine alone, just let it do its thing. But if the machine is compromised and it's causing issues within your corporate network, that's causing some business issues one way or the other, potential exposure of information. In fact, when you're faced as an IT person with the conundrum of do I disconnect this from the network or not, what's best practice for that?
Well, I think it depends on what the system is that's being impacted. Clearly, if it's your Exchange server, then you've got a different level of approach. If it's just an end user, you pull the Ethernet cord, and you just pull the power plug. You don't even shut down. You just pull the plug,
Mhm.
simply because you don't. If there's malware that's installed that has invokes some shutdown procedure cleaning, and some backdoor kind of log covering, then you want to be able to just pull the plug, shut it right down, leave it alone. Give the user a new PC and start over, and just pretty much collect that piece of evidence. If it's a server, I think you have to be a little more tactful in your business continuity plan, and I think that your incident response plan absolutely needs to be thinking about how you're going to
Mhm.
respond to critical systems, especially if your systems, like in our particular case, they're replicated. So you're replicating your problem. And so you need to be mindful that, yeah, you might have one data center, but you might have that problem replicated across the board. So it's important to have snapshots for known times in history and things like that you can recover back to. Make sure you have good point of recovery objectives for your organization.
Yeah, it's a very good point about the replication too. I wasn't thinking about that, but that's a good
Mhm.
point. Unique perspective. We're talking about law enforcement and also being in financial services. You, what would you think from your unique perspective right now would be the most significant information security threat to community institutions, banks, and credit unions?
Yeah, I think in the heightened season of buying and gift giving, we see a lot of retail activity going on. Certainly, credit card skimming is one that is it's an age old, really fast way to get credit card information. I think we're getting smarter in that area with additional controls. Really, phishing attacks are targeted spear phishing attacks are really something that you see a lot in organizations. And I think it's really important to make sure that you have good user education, because your largest threat, your insider threat,
Hmm.
your folks that have just absolutely the best intention, but they're just duped. When you have campaigns that are run internally, and you target your team, and you get those click throughs, and you just have to make sure that they're educated and aware. Um, I always joke that you potty train them at gunpoint, right? So, but it's something that's going to happen, and they're going to target, and also text message phishing. Targeted text messaging is something that we're seeing now too. Like, hey, this is the CEO. I need you to send me some gift cards. Those types of things. You see that in all the time. And believe it or not, as corny as that may sound, there's some people that really just fall to that
Hmm.
because they just want their pleasers, and they want to make sure they're doing the right thing. And they feel like that's their obligation. So it's important to have really good educational campaigns, and you're testing those routinely.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point that I wanted to emphasize. When talking about insider threat, more often than not, that doesn't mean intentional maliciousness.
Hmm.
It's just, as you were saying, the employee is doing what they think that they're supposed to be doing. They're trying to be the pleaser by taking care of that, or they're just they're they're human and they click on a link. And so that's
Hmm.
why, to your point about training, it's so important to run those phishing exercises to help build that muscle memory so that they see something, and even if it looks really good, they stop and say, "Wait, wait, 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 this doesn't make any sense. Why are they asking me to do this? They've never asked that before."
Hmm.
So, well, I know beforehand, before we started recording too, we've talked a little bit about physical security and
Hmm.
ways that physical security can be um, abused or just worked around. One of the things that I really like is, and I've talked about this on the podcast before. I got one of these little Flipper Zero things, and one of the first things I did with it was I cloned my key fob for my office space here, and successfully am able to use this to get in. But there are so many things that you can do with it. Just for example, I was watching a video on denial of service for a car key fob, because apparently car key fobs nowadays, they rotate the frequency, and if you clone your frequency and then try it again, and the car knows that you're trying to use a frequency or a code that was used before, it'll lock itself out. So you could DDoS somebody just walk into their vehicle if you happen to be near them with one of these things. What do you see as like some real dangers with regards to physical security
Hmm.
in the RF and other frequency space?
Yeah, very interesting conversation, and we only have 15 minutes, right?
15 to 25,
um,
we're doing fine. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So jamming attacks, and from which is what you're talking about, DDoS and jamming, more or less an inconvenience factor to because rolling codes do change on some of the newer cars. They do have a little bit better technology deployed to prevent remote spoofing, but it is still possible. Replay attacks is what they call that. And if you have a device readily accessible like the Flipper Zero, which is a couple $100 device that you go online, you buy it, and you go through some user training, and next thing you know, you're Jason Bourne, and you're stealing cars and do.
That
But
that's not
it's
why
not
I
that
got it,
simple.
though. I'm not stealing
Yeah,
cars, just
yeah,
a
yeah. It's just not that simple. GPS spoofing, replay attacks, things like that device works really well for. I think that's more of an experimental. You have some range limitations. There's a really decent antenna in the upper right hand side of that circuit board on that particular device that gets you some pretty good range.
Mhm.
What you really should be mindful of is if you're looking at physical security, right? And that's most facilities that are more modernized have proximity card readers. You'll have a prox card that you'll come up and you'll beep into the building, and that'll get you pretty much access into the facility. I know the alarm in my building here, I've got an RFID that will allow me to disable the alarm when I walk in. I just tap it onto the panel, and my alarm is disarmed.
Mhm.
So those are all IOCs that you have to be mindful of. That if somebody gets a hold of your keys with a Flipper Zero, they can replicate, they can read that RFID and store it, and then come back and then play it back later. They've got access to the front door and your
Oh,
alarm.
yeah, and the amount of time that it takes to do that is virtually like a second. If you stepped away from your office
Second,
and
second.
somebody like me had this, I could
Hmm.
you wouldn't know, which makes it so much more important for people to just be mindful of where they're keeping their keys and their other,
Hmm.
cards and all of that. I think that the
Hmm.
general public probably doesn't realize just how easy it is to do those sorts of things.
Well, they talk about having RFID wallets,
Mhm,
things like that prevent people from being able to be near you or in proximity of you to steal that RFID. But that would be a pretty targeted attack on a particular individual. Like you would be you would be staking that person out, finding out where their travel habits are. We know that Dave goes to McAllister's on Tuesdays. He sets his keys on the table. I walk up and I read it real quick, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is a Microsoft Surface Duo 2, which has integrated NFC reader, and I can actually read and write to an NFC card with this particular device.
Mhm.
Um, so it's an ordinary cell phone. Android has that capability. So does Apple. But more particularly is long range reading of those particular things. And this is a software defined radio, or an SDR. I know it's a little hard to read with the blur here, but this basically is a USB device that plugs into your computer with some software, and it will scan a wide range of frequencies from very low megahertz into the gigahertz bands. This is a receive only device, but it can actually receive broadcast radio all the way up to and including RFID device patterns. Then there's devices like the Hack RF1, which is an actual transmitter. It's about the size of, I'd say, probably the size of an iPhone Pro Max, and it will actually send and receive data. So it can be used in conjunction with a targeted antenna. You could be in a car halfway across the parking lot. Used to make antennas like these out of Pringles cans. They're called a cantenna.
Yes, yes,
Probably heard of
yes,
those.
Yago or Yagi?
Yep, the Yagi.
Yagi, yes, actually, boy, you triggers just one little memory way back probably about 15, 17 years ago. I owned a mini farm. My wife, she had horses, and one was going to go into labor, and I'm like, I can rig up a basic webcam, and you have to remember back in like 2002, doing something like that, that was hard. But yeah, I used Pringle cans on both sides, and was able to massage it, get the signal, and we were able to
Yep.
watch the new baby foal. I guess that's redundant, from wherever we were at.
Right, and I've been a general class ham radio operator now for about 30
I thought you were
years,
gonna say
and
you were a
so
general class ham, but
I am a ham, though. Can you tell? Uh, but being in the amateur radio service, I have access to a lot of that technology, a lot of radio technology, slow scan TV, those kinds of things. POSAG decoders, which can decode. If you remember the old pager days, you'd have the two-way pagers, the Motorola pagers. I was reading pager texts, that was so in the clear, unencrypted. It was crazy. You could almost, if you camped out with proper equipment halfway across the parking lot, you could read some pretty crazy stuff in some restricted areas. Not saying that I did, but
for testing
I'm saying that
purposes,
it's
obviously, yeah.
very, very easy to
Yeah.
do. But anyways, to your point, but with targeted antennas and the Hack RF1, for an example, you could be reading somebody using an RF device, and then you can capture, and then when the coast is clear, you replay that, and the door opens, and you're in. And so they don't, with a flipper zero, you gotta kind of be pretty close.
Right, right.
So when you talk about physical security, financial institutions, they have protocols in place, like no one person comes into the facility alone. You circle the building. You're looking for the spot the knot. They trim bushes down. So if you see a guy with the hoodie, sitting on the bench, it's probably not a good idea to approach the building.
Yeah.
But there is a risk there, and the technology and the tools with things like the Raspberry Pi and other small little portable computing devices for under $100, you can be pretty damaging to a small organization. And when I talk about wireless, the credit union that I am employed by, we deploy really high level wireless defense technology through like Meraki Air Marshal, which will actively attempt to shut down spoofed hotspots to prevent man in the middle attacks, things like
Mhm.
that. So there's technology that you have to deploy, in the financial space to help protect your members and your employees.
Well, you got me thinking about, in information security, we have clean desk protocols, which unfortunately right
Yep.
now, if you can see behind me, I'm not exactly 100% clean desk right now, but it can't be read through this. But I'm wondering about like the value of if someone knew what their RF environment was like.
Mhm.
Where I'm getting at is that, do you think that there's value in trying to create a clean RF environment so that you're sure of the signals that are in a particular critical area, and you've identified where each of the signals come from? Or am I like being too like Jason Bourne here?
No, Greg, you're spot on. It's called a side channel attack to view monitor traffic. So each particular, I don't know, the best way to put it is you can capture the pulses, the impulses on on a monitor screen, and with specific software like AirSpy or Tempest SDR, software like that, you can actually decode the pops and cracks that come out of that RF, and you can actually decode text.
Hmm.
So you can see what somebody is typing. But again, relatively proximity based. If you're inside a facility that's relatively secure, for an example, you're in a controlled banking branch. Let's just say it's less likely that if somebody walked in with a laptop and they cracked that thing open in the lobby, and they're doing whatever, there's more questions that are going to be asked. But if you're in a public facility or a public location, I would be really careful about what you're doing. Just because those side channel attacks can be deployed for those purposes. So to conduct RF, I know the DoD is very big on no Bluetooth devices, no wireless
Right.
devices, even mice and keyboards. They frown on it. They've laxed back a little bit that over the years on that, but anything that Marconi sent the first signal, across the ocean, with a carrier wave, and that's all in the air. If it's in the air, it's in the open.
Yep.
That's just the way it is.
Yeah, and I remember reading about that on the internet. So, but
Mhm. Got to be true
gotta
then.
be true. Abraham Lincoln said so. You mentioned,
Sure.
early on in your career, that at one point in time you were putting in, 80 to 90 hours a week. Now, that got me thinking about how stressful that IT can be, and certainly law enforcement as well. I would imagine that over the course of your career, you figured out a few ways on how you can decompress and get away, because you can't be on constant stress level 24 by 7 by 365. You would not be here today. So what's one thing that you do to help decompress?
Yeah, well, first of all, I've ate many a share of pizza and slept on the floor of my data center. That's happened. If you've been in IT, you realize you don't own IT; it owns you,
Yes.
and you have to have a healthy work-life balance, Greg. And there's two ways to do that. One, you should have systems and technology in place, a good SeamSock tool that's got the shields are up when you're sleeping, right? The things that are watching the edge while you can't.
Mhm.
Make sure that those tools are well aligned, they're tested and ready to go. That gives you a little bit of sense of security. It certainly keeps you up at night. And then you just have to have a really good hobby. Some folks game and they do different things. Myself, I have different hobbies. I'm still in the amateur radio community. I like to. I actually have a small business and I do laser engraving. So I tend to find ways to do that. I spend time with my family when I can, and really just try to allow myself to unplug from that and turn it off. Have faith in the people that you have working with you and for you, so that you know that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and you build your organization on trust, the trust principle, and you just try to address things as they come up with a clear, level, calm approach, um, and keep your boss off CNN.
Good words of wisdom, particularly the last one. So what are your future plans?
For me, I'm looking at the next decade for me. Having reached what I would consider to be the precipice of a career path. I've worked my way from the service desk to running wire, and networking and everything to the desk, and now as in the IT administration and governance space. I like to see myself grow and learn more about the organizational process in the banking and finance space. how is IT being used to leverage technology to make and enhance the lives of our members. And I think for me, I would like to learn more about that. That's what I see myself doing in the next 10 years, and then retire. I've had a very long career, and the wife and I are looking at down the road, what does the next 10 to 12 years look for us, and we're just trying to put the money in the bank and look forward to that golden opportunity to spend time with the grandkids.
Awesome. Dave, it's been a fabulous conversation. I might have to come back and talk to you in a little bit after I've learned a little bit more about this in the next few months because, again, I realize that this sort of thing and all that other stuff can be really dangerous. And you actually also triggered, I'm putting together a list of predictions. And I think that for 2023, because I've been asking other folks and been talking about that on the podcast, I think I just figured out one for 2023. But anyway, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. It was a great kickoff for 2023.
That's great, Greg, and I'm glad to be part of that. And thank you so much for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you, sir, and stay secure.